Well, I'd like to thank you all to this last session, which is focused on keeping children safe online, specifically by looking at the safety by design model that's being led by Julie Inman Grant, who is the e-safety commissioner in Australia. This session will be moderated by Ernie Allen, and Ernie was the founder and president of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children for almost a quarter century, also known as NCMEC. He also was the founder and president of the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and he left those positions to create a global alliance called We Protect, which is a multi-sectoral approach to bringing together survivors and industry and governments and civil organizations to try and lead solutions in keeping children safe online. And so we're so honored to have Ernie here to moderate this, our last session today, focused on 21st century forms of child abuse, the impact of digital technologies, and for him to introduce e-safety commissioner Julie Inman Grant. Ernie?
Thank you, Warren, and thank you to you and the Kempe Center for your extraordinary leadership. For all of our viewers, you know, the Kempe Center is the world's oldest and most respected child abuse institution. And for the Kempe Center to focus on these issues, I think is really timely and exciting. So I'm delighted to introduce truly, and this is not an exaggeration, the world's preeminent voice for protecting children in the digital world, the e-safety commissioner of Australia, Julie Inman Grant. Julie leads the world's first government regulatory agency committed to keeping its citizens safe online. She brings long experience to this role. She'd worked in the nonprofit and government sectors and held senior roles in the tech industry at Microsoft, Twitter, and Adobe. In her 17 years at Microsoft, she was global director for safety and privacy policy and outreach. I had the honor of knowing and working with her for many years. She chaired the technical working group for the Child Dignity Alliance, and she serves as a board member of the We Protect Global Alliance. And she also serves on the World Economic Forum's Global Coalition for Digital Safety. She's brought serious regulation to a previously unregulated space. A primary example was Australia's trailblazing Online Safety Act of 2021. Her vision and impact are being recognized in Australia and worldwide. She was named one of Australia's most influential women by the Australian Financial Review and named a leading Australian in foreign affairs by the Sydney Morning Herald. The World Economic Forum and Apolitical named her one of the Agile 50, the world's 50 most influential leaders revolutionizing government. Finally, recognizing her extraordinary leadership, last year the government of Australia reappointed her to a new 5-year term as Australia's e-safety commissioner. I'm honored to present the e-safety commissioner of Australia, Julie Inman Grant.
Thank you so much, Ernie, for that very, very generous welcome, and thank you very much for having me. I come to you here from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We always pay tribute to the native indigenous owners of the land on which we come. You may have noticed already that I have an American accent. I actually come from the land of the Suquamish and Duwamish people. So Chief South was the chief, and Seattle, my hometown, is what he was named for. In any case, why don't we go to the first slide? I really do want to thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this really important event. It's just never been more vital to find meaningful answers to the questions on how we keep children safer, both online and in the real world. So following its release earlier this year, the Australian Child Maltreatment Study showed that a staggering 1 in 4 Australians between the ages of 16 and 24 reported experiencing sexual abuse before the age of 18. When the study cast the network wider to include Australians aged 16 to 65, probably that upper generation not used to talking about things like sexual abuse, 28.5% of the 8,500 Australians surveyed reported experiencing sexual abuse before the age of 18. Now, the study also confirmed what many of us already knew, which is the fact that child sexual abuse is incredibly gendered, with girls being around 2.5 times more likely to experience sexual abuse than boys. And we know that the damage to these children doesn't just begin and end with the abuse. It follows them throughout their entire lives. Children who are the victims of sexual abuse are more likely to experience sexual assault or domestic and family violence later in life. They're more likely to develop dependencies on drugs or alcohol, and they're more likely to develop long-term mental health issues or experience suicidal ideation. And as many of you are aware, this can also eventually lead to child victims becoming future offenders. Child sexual abuse, therefore, is a societal problem. It's not just an online problem or an individual one, but it's clear that the internet has allowed this cancer to metastasize by giving predators easy access to a global repository of potential young victims, where this used to be interfamilial or based on contact offending. Now, while there always be those who will seek to prey on children, the ease with which they can perpetrate these crimes online has a lot to do with how the internet was constructed. When we look back through the history of the internet and social media, it's clear for all to see that it was never really built for children, despite the fact that today children actually make up 1/3 of the world's internet users. So, unlike any previous generation, kids today are complete digital natives. The internet has become their playground, their schoolroom, and their friendship circle. It's a place to meet kindred spirits, for them to find acceptance and navigate the tricky ups and downs of those awkward teen years. But of course, we know it's also a place that can expose children to a range of harms that may have long-lasting impacts on their development, well-being, and safety. So how exactly did we get here? Next slide, please. It wasn't really that long ago that the internet was in its infancy and the world was still very much in an analog state. While computers have been networked in one form or another since the 1960s, it wasn't until the 90s, when affordable personal computers met the 56K modem, that the internet really took off. These game-changing devices finally brought the internet to the masses, allowing people to slip on a pair of digital board shorts and really start surfing the web. It was a time of great promise, and it was also a time when many thought that overregulation of this burgeoning industry would be an impediment to innovation and growth. Tech companies were moving fast and breaking things and only wanted one thing from governments: to stay out of their way. And for the most part, governments around the world were happy to oblige. Next slide, please. I know this time well, having worked at Tech Policy Ground Zero in 1995 and 96 as a young Washington, D.C. government relations professional. Of course, because it was the 90s, I had big hair, big shoulder pads, and even bigger ideals, and found myself working for an unassuming guy named Bill at a little software company called Microsoft. At the time, it was Microsoft, AOL, Novell, Alta Vista, Netscape that were the big end of town. And looking to the future through our rosy techno-utopian glasses, we only had eyes for the promise of this new online revolution. Of course, this was Web 1.0 and social media wasn't really a thing yet. In fact, I bet Mark Zuckerberg was about 12 years old and probably more concerned with building his latest Dungeons and Dragons adventure than he was the world's largest social media network. But with rapid advances in technology and computing power just around the corner, the internet we were preparing for would quickly outpace all of our imaginations. Next slide, please. So this rapid evolution from the early Web 0.1 world to the 2.0 version we all know today has been truly astounding. And today's internet really is an amazing place, bringing humanity so many benefits. I still scratch my head wondering how we could have continued to work, to learn, to connect, and communicate during the past couple of years during the COVID-19 pandemic, as the social world we had all taken for granted disappeared almost entirely overnight. And when I think back to those early days in the 1990s, the internet was still a bit of a novelty. Today, I'd argue it's become an essential utility. But of course, as we all know, this amazing tool has its dark side, particularly when it comes to the sexual abuse of children, which is becoming increasingly prevalent, commodified, organized, and extreme. It's a crime that has long-lasting and devastating impacts on victim survivors who must not only deal with the physical and emotional aftermath of sexual abuse, but also the threat of constant re-traumatization every time their image is shared online. In the 2022 report of the US National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC detailed that almost 32 million reports of child sexual abuse material received from US-based tech companies, an almost 20% increase on the number of reports it received in 2021. In Australia, we've also seen huge increases in reports of online child sexual abuse material, which began to spike in early 2020 as the COVID lockdowns took hold and the whole world moved online. Since then, we were hoping to see a bit of a plateau of online abuse, but we've now seen a year-on-year doubling of reports of online child sexual abuse material, culminating in the first quarter of this year when we saw a tripling of reports compared to the same period the year before. Next slide, please. Today, we sit on the cusp of what may well be the next great digital revolution as we open our collective arms to embrace generative AI and clamor to inhabit the virtual spaces of the metaverse. We now have a once-in-a-generation chance to build a safer and more inclusive Web 3.0 world with child protection as one of its core foundations. So what is being done to actively protect the rights of Internet's youngest users? Of course, we all have a role to play, but I believe long-term solutions really lie in creating safer online spaces to begin with, to prevent these harms from happening in the first place. But before I talk about how we can achieve this, I'd like to first give you a bit of insight into who we are and what we do. Next slide, please. Now, eSafety is Australia's online safety regulator, and our primary focus from the day of our creation 8 years ago in 2015 has been protecting children from online harm. In fact, eSafety serves as Australia's hotline in the global fight against online child sexual abuse material online, like the Internet Watch Foundation in the UK, the Canadian Centre for Child Protection in Canada, or NCMEC in the US. Like those important organizations, we also serve as an active member of InHope, the global network of 52 member hotlines tackling online child sexual abuse. Back in 2015, we were the first and only government online safety regulator in the world, and we had no real playbook to follow. So we've really had to fill the pages as we've gone along, but now I believe we have an effective regulatory model that not only protects and supports individuals, but also puts pressure on industry to be more transparent, accountable, and to place a higher value on safety. Over the next few minutes, I'll explain how we are using our systemic regulatory tools to make the online world a safer place for children and make life more difficult for those who seek to prey upon them. Next slide, please. I'd like to think what we're doing in Australia from a regulatory perspective may serve as a good model for other countries and jurisdictions in tackling these issues. And I would say that if the US took action, it would be truly game-changing. But eSafety takes a holistic, harms-based, and trauma-informed approach to protecting human rights online. So protection stands alongside prevention and proactive and systemic change as the three pillars of eSafety's regulatory model. And it's this model that's underpinned by partnerships, including our critical partnerships with fellow governments, regulators, law enforcement agencies, and NGOs like the We Protect Global Alliance. Next slide, please. Now, eSafety is set up as to serve as a safety net for Australians who have experienced abuse online and when the platforms have failed to act in protecting their users. Through our many world-first reporting schemes, we advocate on behalf of all Australians, helping to bridge that inherent power gap that exists between them and the big tech behemoths. While we're not the proactive content moderators of the internet, we do provide real relief to people experiencing online harm to report to us. And we know the quicker we get this content taken down, the more relief we provide. And just to give you an example, we had a very vulnerable Indigenous trans child who was being A fight video was being filmed of her while she was being beat up, and we were very concerned for her welfare. It was starting to go viral. We were able to work with Instagram to get that down within 12 minutes. So again, the more quickly we get this down, the more distress we're relieving on the target. So this includes our child cyberbullying scheme, which I just mentioned, our new serious adult cyber abuse scheme, which is pitched much higher because adults are meant to be more resilient, and we wanted to avoid both defamation and freedom of expression issues. And of course, our image-based abuse scheme, providing help to people who've had their intimate images and videos shared online without their consent. I decline to call it revenge porn because I find that an inherently victim blaming term. You know, revenge for what? And this is not porn for the prurient interest. It sort of trivializes the impact that this actually has on the target. Now, our investigators in the IBA, or the image-based abuse scheme, have recently been deluged by reports of sexual extortion, backed by overseas organized criminal networks, a social engineering scam metastasizing around the world at the moment. We also target illegal and restricted content, such as child sexual exploitation material, as well as material that promotes or advocates terrorist acts. Our latest analysis of child abuse reports through the scheme shows that 1 in 8 involved a perpetrator directing a child to perform explicit acts via webcam or smartphone. Our investigators reanalyzed about 1,300 URLs from last financial year to better understand where and how children were being abused online, finding that 12% of the material was what we call coerced but self-generated. The analysis also showed that about 25%, or a quarter of the material, was produced in the privacy of bedrooms and bathrooms in the family home. In some of the videos, you can actually hear the parents calling the children down for dinner. So it's literally happening under our parents' noses. Now, all of our complaints-based regulatory schemes give us an incredibly unique evidence base to understand harmful trends and where the systemic failings with the industry lie. We can see how they respond and the rate at which we continue to see the same kinds of trends of abuse happening. They also support us. They allow us to support the individuals in the grip of a personal online crisis by compelling social media platforms and websites to take down abusive and harmful content within 24 hours. We have a 90% success rate, both for image-based abuse and for youth-based cyberbullying. And again, we work closely with the platforms to get this taken down as quickly as possible. Next slide, please. Now, where protection is a priority in our fight to safeguard Australians online, particularly the very young, our ultimate goal is to prevent these online harms from happening in the first place, which is why we put such a huge focus on fundamental research, awareness, and behavioral change in the broader online safety space. Education to build digital resilience and hone critical reasoning skills must start really young, just as online exposure starts young. Our research shows that 94% of 4-year-olds in Australia have some kind of access to a digital device, and we simply cannot allow our children to their own devices on their devices. So we start with an early years program for parents of 0s to 5s, as they are the front lines of defense. We know that as these kids grow up, they will face significant challenges that those of my generation and yours were never confronted with. From online bullying and pressure to share intimate images with peers, to unwanted messages or contact from strangers, including attempts at grooming and sexual extortion, the online world our kids now inhabit can be a very, very dangerous place. And we don't believe that children, parents, schools, or law enforcement should be forced to shoulder the full burden for addressing these online harms either. So this leads me to the next slide. And this brings us also to our third key pillar, proactive and systemic change through something we call safety by design. Coupled with our international engagement, a little bit of crystal ball gazing to anticipate new harms coming over the horizon. In addition, we also now wield new world-first systemic powers to help promote this change and raise online safety standards across the online ecosystem. And finally, we're building partnerships to extend our influence and learn from others. We work with regulators from Fiji, Ireland, the UK, South Africa, France, Germany, South Korea through the Global Online Safety Regulators Network, which was something that we set up and launched last year in Washington, D.C. at the Family Online Safety Institute Summit. And we just had our first online regulator meeting, or in-person regulator meeting in London last month. Next slide, please. So let me turn to safety by design. What's clear to me after 8 years of regulating the digital environment is that if we really want to create a safer online world, we also need to revolutionize technology design. Safety by design is a proactive approach to safety that helps prompt technology companies to anticipate, detect, and eliminate online risks before they materialize. Another thing I've learned is that you achieve better outcomes by doing things with industry rather than to industry, which is why a big part of our work involves industry collaboration and providing information and tools to improve safety practices. But by prioritizing safety from the beginning, safety by design helps build an inclusive and less toxic online environment and shows that prioritizing people's safety and well-being not only has benefits for society, but also makes good business sense and hits the bottom line. In my experience, companies respond to significant regulatory, revenue, and reputational challenges. And if they're getting on the front foot and embedding safety at the front end, they're mitigating some of the risks, not only to their users, but to their platforms going forward. And I think industry are really starting to realize that allowing harms such as child sexual exploitation material, image-based abuse, and online harassment and intimidation, if they allow it to flourish on their platforms, it really is bad for business. Next slide, please. I often draw comparisons to the transformation that occurred within the car industries to explain the opportunity that sits just within reach of the online industry. It's hard to believe that it was more than 50 years ago that a young American lawyer named Ralph Nader began questioning car makers' accountability for traffic fatalities, critically examining the intersection between vehicle design, the lack of embedded safety features, and the resultant injury and death. Deaths that were totally preventable through the use of seatbelts. His ideas culminated in a book that you may be familiar with called Unsafe at Any Speed. And this led to a new era of automobile regulation, still guided today by international standards. Predictably, at the time, the auto industry vehemently pushed back. They didn't want to embed seatbelts or further invest in safety. But once these features were made compulsory, the car fatality death toll rapidly diminished, saving untold millions of lives. Of course, today we take for granted that there are anti-lock brakes and airbags built in, or that car manufacturers now differentiate themselves in the marketplace based on the amount of safety tech they can cram into their vehicles. Proof that safety sells. But to stretch the car analogy even further, the online world as we know it was not built for safety. It was ultimately built for speed. Hence the famous motto of moving fast and breaking things. But I believe we're fast approaching big tech's seatbelt moment, and momentum is growing globally for user safety to become a core design consideration. That virtual seatbelts should be deployed online now to protect our children from accessing the darkest recesses of the web. Next slide, please. Make no mistake about it, the platforms have known the harms caused for decades, and they know how their platforms have been systematically weaponized. What we need them to do is to better assess the risks and mitigate the harms by developing and deploying a safety by design mindset across the life cycle of every product, service, and platform. It also has to start with leadership from the top and be inculcated throughout the organization, including incentives for engineers and product designers to make these products safer. It's encouraging to see that this initiative is starting to be discussed in parliaments and in boardrooms around the world as the push towards broader online safety regulation is rapidly gathering steam. Next slide, please. At eSafety, we've been championing safety by design since 2018. We wanted to bring the tech sector along on this journey as it represents a huge cultural shift in terms of how online services are conceptualized, designed, and ultimately deployed. The tech sector, of course, is diverse, and no regulator is going to be able to dictate or prescribe the best safety protections for any and all given products. So we needed a robust set of principles to guide this work. After 9 months of deep consultation, we arrived at 3 key pillars with the industry in 2019. And these include defining service provider responsibility, providing user empowerment and autonomy, and demonstrating more radical transparency and accountability. We well understand that the principles needed to be actionable, meaningful, and achievable, and that the approach needed to encourage innovation and investment and to surface up and incentivize good safety practice. Next slide. All the faces and logos you can see here are of some of the key industry players that worked with us on this. And after these were embraced by so many technology leaders, we started to see a proliferation of tech principles leading to a certain degree of principles fatigue. We knew if they were to be effective that the principles needed to be implemented into good safety practice. Next slide, please. So after a further 18 months of consultation with more than 180 organizations, we at eSafety released 2 interactive safety by design assessment tools, one for startups and one for mid-tier and enterprise companies. Now, the tools take participants through sets of questions to ask what systems, processes, and practices they have in place. Each participant's response generates a tailored report that acts as both a safety health check, but also as a learning resource to promote continual online safety improvements. Our goal was to more deeply embed safety into the culture, ethos, and operations of these businesses, from the product conception through to implementation. And we believe this will engender a culture of innovation, will motivate tech workers who want to create technology for good, and hopefully preempt damaging tech wrecks that I do not believe are inevitable. And we want to demonstrate that safety by design, again, just makes good business sense. Next slide, please. As I touched on earlier, we're not stopping there. We have a 5-phase roadmap. We've developed tools for venture capitalists so that they can invest ethically and manage their own risks. So beyond our interactive assessment tools, there are VC checklists and due diligence clauses. To shape a new generation of future engineers, lawyers, entrepreneurs, and computer scientists that code with conscience, we believe that safety by design practices need to be taught alongside the fundamentals of ICT. We've been successful in ensuring that safety by design concepts are now incorporated into Australia's school curriculum, and we're piloting concepts across multidisciplinary programs at a number of Australian universities. And this includes a free 12-hour safety by design MOOC, massively online. I can't remember what it stands for, but you can download it. We've got 12 hours of safety by design lessons that anyone can access, that we released with the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. Again, to ensure that the next generation of technologists is thinking about human-centered design with safety at the core. Next slide, please. Now, safety by design is both about re-engineering the online world we have now, but also about resurfacing the need for further innovation in safety tech to provide those over-the-top protections. We do need to fix the fundamentals first, but so much of what our safety by design assessment tools surface up is the safety functionality that is missing. And there is today, and will continue to be, a huge market for the safety tech sector to provide more granular parental controls that are incorporated in most operating systems, or robust tools to halt online harassment, or outsource content moderation functionality, or to offer trust and safety as a service. The perfect use case to these powerful new AI tools that we're seeing coming on board. And again, our hope is that by embedding a safety lens into current and future companies, we'll not only ensure that we bolster and drive up standards of safety within the companies themselves, but that this will also act as a catalyst in building a thriving and responsible technology ecosystem. Safety tech fits squarely into the domain of user empowerment and autonomy. And this burgeoning industry is already demonstrating the specialization and safety competencies needed to supplement native controls. In many ways, the sky is the limit for this new industry to thrive. It is what consumers and increasingly governments are demanding: a safer, more civil, and more positive online operating environment. Next slide. Whether it's safety by design or safety tech or regulation, we need to find ways to talk about how we improve the overall ecosystem through global systemic changes. And we need to do this together to actively shape the Web 3.0 world of the future. We do not want to see the increased weaponization of deep fakes through sophisticated generative AI, the exploitation of algorithms, or a totally decentralized internet where there is no responsibility or accountability, without the ability to remediate these harms and by shaping user solutions. So my call to action is to learn from the mistakes of our past and create a much better internet for the future, one that promotes safety by design up and down the tech stack and across the digital ecosystem through the bolstering of the safety tech sector. It's also my hope and vision that soon a time will come when we take for granted the safety precautions that are built into our online services, just as we do in our cars. Next slide, please. But we also have some powerful new regulatory tools to help encourage this cultural shift within the industry, thanks to Australia's reform of the Online Safety Act, which came into effect the 23rd of January last year. Now, this act sets a higher safety standard for technology companies operating in Australia and grants e-safety new world-first systemic powers to compel them to be more transparent about how they deal with harmful content on their platforms and encourage them to take meaningful action to address it. Next slide. The first of these systemic powers are the basic online safety expectations. Under the expectations, the Australian government expects tech companies to take fundamental measures to protect users, especially children. The expectations grant me the power to require companies to report on their progress and publish the findings. Last August, we sent legal notices to 7 tech companies: Apple, Meta, Microsoft, Snap, WhatsApp, Skype, and Omegle. We asked them to report how they are fighting child sexual exploitation and abuse. And we sought detailed answers informed by our own data and insights from victims, law enforcement, civil society, and academia, as well as gaps in current industry transparency reports. And what we discovered was that some of the biggest and most powerful companies in the world are simply not doing enough to tackle online child sexual exploitation and abuse. Next slide, please. Now, our report exposed the inconsistent and inadequate efforts of these companies in detecting child sexual abuse material, grooming, and live streaming. It revealed glaring discrepancies in response times to user reports concerning child sexual exploitation and abuse on their services. For example, Snap's average response time was 4 minutes, while Microsoft's was 2 days, extending up to 19 days when reports required re-reviewing. Apple had no in-app reporting functionality at all. They had a little email and they couldn't answer whether or not these were actually responded to. So many of you will have seen the HEAT initiative take some of these findings in the US and is putting pressure on Apple, not only to scan for child sexual abuse images, but to create responsible and responsive reporting mechanisms. Simply put, the platforms lack incentives to address this issue because their business models rely on attracting high volumes of users to build their advertising revenue. So for them, closing accounts or preventing recidivism, as we call it, is counterintuitive. We also uncovered inconsistent and sometimes non-existent scanning for known child sexual abuse and limited attempts to root out new child sexual abuse material or live streaming. Our findings are backed up by inconsistent reporting of child abuse material by some of the biggest companies in the world to our sister hotline, NCMEC. As I mentioned earlier, in 2022, the prevalence of CSEA reported by digital platforms to NCMEC was a staggering at 32 million. Meta reports just over 27 million instances of child sexual abuse on its products, including Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, while Apple, with its billions of handsets and iPads, all connected to iCloud and iMessage, reported just 234. 27 million versus 234. If we're really going to get a true appreciation for the scale of the problem, companies simply need to do more to surface this material, and they can do it in privacy, respecting, and protective ways. Next slide, please. But of course, Generating, storing, and distributing child sexual abuse material online is not limited to just 7 platforms. So in February, we sent legal notices to 5 more companies, including X, formerly known as Twitter, TikTok, Google, Twitch, and Discord. We also asked them about their efforts in addressing online child sexual abuse, sexual extortion, and harmful algorithms. We will share the findings in a report published shortly in the next couple of weeks. There can be no accountability without transparency, and we will continue to use our compulsion powers on more platforms and on more harms to drive widespread change and raise safety standards across the industry. As the esteemed US Supreme Court Justice Brandeis once said, "Sunlight is the best disinfectant," and indeed, where we shine a light, companies cannot continue to refuse to act. Next slide, please. Now, the expectations work hand in hand with another of my systemic powers under the Act, the new mandatory online safety codes and standards. The first set of enforceable codes and standards address illegal and restricted content, including child sexual exploitation material and pro-terrorist content. These apply to 8 sectors: social media services, websites, search engines, app stores, internet service providers, device manufacturers, hosting services, and services like email, messaging, gaming, and dating sites. These codes and standards are essential tools in our regulatory efforts to address safety vulnerabilities. The industry has been responsible for drafting the codes and offering solutions to ensure community safeguards. Next slide, please. After nearly 2 years of negotiations, and I must admit that I myself have been surprised with the pushback we've received from industry on tackling illegal content, I did make some final determination on the draft code submitted to us in June. Of the 8 codes, I rejected 2 due to insufficient community safeguards against illegal and restricted content. These codes covered apps, websites, file and photo storage services, dating sites, online games, and instant messaging. Instead, we are developing mandatory industry standards for these 2 sectors. I also reserved a decision on the draft search engines code due to concerns about its compatibility with recent developments in generative AI and its integration to search engines. There was no mention of generative AI, even though Google and Microsoft had just announced that they were integrating generative AI and that it would revolutionize search. So I sent them back to the table, which they thankfully did, and they've come back with something that I'm satisfied meets appropriate community standards, and I have registered the search code. Now, once all of these codes and standards are in place, it's our hope that Australia will set the global benchmark for how industry tackles the scourge of online child sexual abuse material. Our second phase of mandatory industry codes and standards will address children's access to inappropriate content, such as pornography, and the work on these codes will begin in earnest once phase 1 is completed. And I'd also note that now that the UK has its powers under the Online Safety Bill, as does Ireland, they will also be working on similar codes. And one of the reasons it's so important that we have formal structures to share is so that we can go from the basement to the dirt floor, up a couple of stairs, and that other regulators can continue building stronger and more robust codes as we go along. So we're pushing the safety standards up together. Next slide, please. So this goes to the well-known adage that combating a network requires a network, which is why our international partnerships with fellow governments, international law enforcement agencies, and child abuse hotlines are so important. For a long time, we've also believed that we needed this global online safety regulators group akin to the Global Privacy Assembly, functioning as an international forum. And as I mentioned, we just met in London. We now have the UK, Australia, Ireland, Fiji. Our network has since grown to include Germany, France, New Zealand, Canada, South Korea, and South Africa. So I think it's hugely important that there's a degree of coherence and coordination between global regulators so that we're avoiding a splinter net of regulation. And while our regulatory systems will never be identical, there will always be different political drivers, it's important that they're aligned to increase our collective effectiveness in regulating these global companies, especially when it comes to protecting children. This network draws on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and core international and regional human rights treaties. And one of the reasons it's important to draw upon these is in the debates that you're seeing in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere around pitting privacy versus safety, and privacy and data protection as a fundamental human right, ignores the fact that there are human rights principles about the best interests of the child and that the children are more vulnerable. And so we've put together a human rights statement, which also calls upon the principles of dignity, equality, and mutual respect, the right to freedom of information, opinion, and expression, the right to freedom of association, the right to privacy, yes, but also the right for children to be protected from exploitation, violence, and abuse, and the right to non-discrimination. And again, we would love the US to become an observer to our global network someday, but it's worth noting that we've also joined our American counterparts in a bilateral effort in combating crimes against children with the formation of the United States Joint Council on Combating Online Child Sexual Exploitation. And our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, will be going out to the US for its first formal meeting with the White House later this month. I'm getting close to wrapping up. So next slide, we'll turn our eyes to the future. So while it's imperative that we continue to build our capability as a regulator and to tackle the harms of today, we must always keep a close eye on the potential harms of tomorrow. The race to colonize the metaverse, combined with astonishing advances in generative AI and sophisticated deepfakes, have dominated the headlines. And while these technologies promise great benefits that may be transformational, we cannot allow safety considerations to be forgotten in the rush by industry to conquer these new technological frontiers. We've already received reports into our investigative branch of generative artificial intelligence being used to create deepfake child sexual abuse images. And we also expect conversational AI will also turbocharge the ability of predators to manipulate, groom, and coerce children with much greater precision. And when it comes to the metaverse, the reality of this new online world is sadly the same as the current one, and we can expect to see the same types of threats in the future metaverse as we see online today. While there inevitably still be content children cannot unsee, it is the conduct, particularly in the dark private spaces of the metaverse, that will be the most cause for concern. Harassment, abuse, cyberbullying, or something akin to sexual harassment and assault are likely to have far more visceral impacts in more immersive environments, especially on children as these digital experiences become more and more lifelike. Immersive technologies also have the potential to shape new harms, combining a physical sensation through haptics with the visual and oral dimension of VR. Imagine the risk to children of wearing an Oculus virtual reality headset where a parent can't look over their shoulders to see what they're seeing or experiencing. And let's say a child is exploring the metaverse from their bedroom wearing a haptic suit where they have full sensory feeling across their body. A future could exist where they could be groomed and physically assaulted in the metaverse while their parents remain unaware in the next room. The Institute of Engineering and Technology has already highlighted that some existing VR apps can enable users to simulate intimate content with school children, normalizing and desensitizing them to various forms of sexual abuse, coercion, and assault. And if you think that some online games are violent now, think about what that experience will be like when you're wearing a full sensory haptic suit and the feeling of the simulative pain of a bullet wound. This is actually being developed. These are hyper-realistic, high sensory experiences that may one day almost be indistinguishable from the real thing, with the potential to inflict real harm and significant trauma. So we have to get ahead of these things. The kind of metaverse we want and the kind of metaverse we end up with will depend on us. And this also goes for present and future iterations of generative AI. And this starts with the architecture that we create and enable to government. Next slide. I want to thank you so much for listening and allowing me to tell you a little bit about eSafety, our multi-layered approach to protecting children online, and our vision for creating lasting change from within the industry and internationally through unified approach to tackling this problem. As a global community, I think we would all agree that the fundamental human rights of children should be protected. They have a right to dignity and to be free from online violence. At this crucial time for digital regulation, we must be decisive in protecting our communities, especially our children, from the potential harms of emerging technologies. And I believe that regulatory scrutiny will have to start at the design phase. As we navigate new technology challenges such as the metaverse and generative AI, we must act swiftly to prevent its misuse, using our existing tools and working with fellow regulators and policymakers to confront these risks head on. eSafety's experience shows that determination, backed by international cooperation and legislative reform, can achieve tangible results. We must continue to hold technology companies accountable for making their platforms safer for all by embracing safety by design principles and applying it to development, deployment, and refresh of their services. But you can't hope to fix a problem unless you're first willing to acknowledge that you have one. So by working together to address systemic failures, compelling transparency, and enforcing meaningful codes of conduct and standards, it's my belief that we can finally have the safer, more inclusive internet we all want and frankly deserve. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was extraordinary. I'd like to invite questions from the audience, and let me begin with one that popped up in the chat box, which I think you largely answered already. But I'm interested in you embellishing it a little bit for the sake of our audience. Laura Reese of Minnesota asked us what U.S. agency is your counterpart? What U.S. agency is a part of your larger global network? You talked about the U.S.-Australia partnership, but my answer to that is there isn't one yet, and there needs to be one. What are your thoughts on that?
And yes, in fact, there was a U.S. Commission on the Future of Technology that not only looked at safety by design, but also looked at the idea of creating something like an eSafety office coordinating mechanism. So in my legislation, my mandate is not only to protect, it's also to coordinate education and all online safety activity nationally. And so, we work with a number of different agencies in the U.S., everyone from the FTC to the FCC. We work closely with the White House, specifically the White House Gender Policy Council. We're part of the global partnership to combat online abuse and harassment that they started with the Danes. And then, of course, you've got the Department of Justice, and the work that they do. But if you think about the significant health messages that came out from the Surgeon General, that's different. I gather that's tied to health. Commerce should have a role. So, I don't know where this would be put. If you created something akin to the eSafety office, you could put it in something like the FTC, or you could put it in the White House, like they have the Office of Technology, is it Standards and Policy, the OSTP?
Yeah.
It would be marvelous to have one counterpart.
Yeah, but in response to Laura's question, there isn't one yet, but there are multiple pieces, but we need to move in that direction. So again, using the prerogative of the moderator, I'd like to ask you to embellish on one other point, and then any other questions people should send flying. I'm interested in your candid assessment on the debate you talked about between privacy and child protection, particularly when some of the very tech companies that you're working with are funding the privacy advocates to oppose government regulation in this space. I thought you made a very compelling point about the fact that privacy is not absolute, one of the key questions is whose privacy. But what is your assessment of that? Are we making progress in that space?
I start with two different sets of I guess I'll start with how the debate seems to play out in the US versus Australia. And I think that has to do with our systems of government. Um, when the e-safety commissioner was set up in 2015, it was in response to a tragedy. A well-known media personality who had been very open about mental health struggles got back on Twitter just as I was applying for the job at Twitter to start their public policy and safety programs in Australia and New Zealand and across Southeast Asia. And she was so terribly trolled on Twitter, she ended up tragically taking her life. And that started a petition that went to the government. And I guess we had the benefit of starting early and starting small as the Children's Safety Commissioner. And we just layered on different functions and programs over time. And it's a bipartisan issue. So the Australian Parliament made the determination through our Online Safety Act that once, of course, we embrace freedom of expression, but once online speech veers into the area of harm and there's serious intent to harm, that's where our policymakers draw the line, and they've empowered us to do this kind of work. My observation, and even watching the debate in Congress and elsewhere, is there isn't unanimity in position around children. The focus on content moderation or censorship is on whether you're suppressing conservative or progressive voices. And until you can kind of get to those fundamental concerns about the well-being of children, I don't know how you're going to succeed in those debates. Now, having worked in privacy, safety, and security for well over 30 years, I can say that the privacy lobby and the digital rights lobby is much more well organized, well funded. They haven't even managed to achieve privacy legislation in the US. But you also have Section 230 and you have the First Amendment. And I think you've got this polarization where you have, First Amendment absolutism on one side. You also have what I would call privacy zealotry. I think we all value our privacy. I consider myself a privacy pragmatist. I mean, any of us who sign up for a social media company we have a free service, but we're paying with our data. Yeah. So I think there's a false binary that's at play here, that you have to totally give up adults' privacy for the sake of child protection. We know that technologies that have been used for well over a decade, like photo DNA, work the same way that anti-spam or anti-malware work in terms of scanning for known child sexual abuse images that have been triple vetted and have something like a 1 in 50 billion false positive rate. So very effective, targeted technologies, not looking to read your emails or text, but to pick up and service child sexual abuse material. So when you see companies using technical feasibility arguments or saying, oh, if we scan for child sexual abuse, that's going to lead to a surveillance society by autocratic governments. No. This is what we call in Australian a furphy. You're just making stuff up to defer the argument. The problem is it takes about 3 or 4 sentences for somebody who knows how these technologies to work to kind of undo that talking point. And it wouldn't be lost on any of you that companies like Signal and WhatsApp threatened to pull out of the UK if they went forward with the online safety bill. The privacy zealotry that's being pointed in very harmful ways towards the Home Affairs Commissioner in Europe and the others who are trying to get some reasonable legislation passed around CSAM is a perfect illustration of how worlds are colliding when they don't really need to.
Yeah, I agree. Additional question from Natalie Chesney. In a presentation earlier today, the difficulty differentiating between post-pubescent adolescents and young adults was noted. How do you identify those minors in order to protect them?
So it depends on the regulatory scheme you're talking about. I mean, some of my investigators have been viewing child sexual abuse material for over 10 years, which is fairly uncommon. In many hotlines and law enforcement agencies, they only allow that kind of engagement with that kind of content for 6 months at a time. We've got some very strong wellness and well-being programs in place, but because we're scanning it, we're building databases all the time and classifying all the time, we have a good sense. If there's ever a question where there's a borderline issue, we're going to err on the side of protecting the child, even if they're a young person. What's really interesting is the most common age of online abuse is between the ages of 18 and 24. This is what we're seeing with sexual extortion. They tend to be young men between those ages. The same with other forms of online harassment and abuse and image-based abuse. And I think what we forget, even though technically an 18-year-old is adult, their cognitive development is not complete. And there's an interesting phase where they're leaving high school. They don't have the same kind of pastoral care. They may not have the same support networks when they go off to college, or what we call TAFE, or community college, or they go into a trade. And so 18 to 24 is a very, very vulnerable age, and where damage can still happen.
Professor Binford, let me draw you into this. You're leading the efforts on behalf of the Kempe Center in terms of advocacy, raising awareness about this. I'm interested in your thoughts about the advocacy challenge that Julie has presented us, and your thoughts about how Kempe can play a role in that.
Yeah, I want to say first that I'm so deeply grateful to you, Julie, for both what you've shared with us today and the groundwork that you've laid, because in listening to your presentation and looking at your slides, you really are talking about an ecological change that we have not had consistent leadership in creating across this industry. It's a relatively young industry, as you pointed out. Really, we're talking about only 30 years or so where the internet has been routinely accessible to most Americans. And for you to identify that we need to be much more intentional about the ecology that's created allows us to be proactive in imagining what we want our digital world to look like, instead of having this fear-based dialogue that's like, they're going to come and steal my children, which is the fear that we have, whether it's steal our children's sexuality through, premature exposure to pornography, or any exposure at any age to extreme pornography, and some of the effects that we're seeing that has on human sexuality, or whether we're talking about, having our children's innocence affected in the inability to develop healthy relationships because of the capturing of images, which are then shared without consent, et cetera, and so on. And so I love the fact that you really have changed the posture in the work that you do, as summarized today, into imagining a healthy ecology for our digital world. And so I'm very grateful to you for that, because in responding to Ernie's question, it allows us to approach advocacy not from a, what about the children in this panicked, watch out for the boogeyman stance, but to say, who do we want to be as a society? Our society has changed. We are never going back to the 20th century. And in some ways, that's wonderful. And there's so much power that you have described today about what we can do and the senses and experiences that we can create as human beings through this technology. And how can we utilize it in the same way that we've utilized cars in a safe and healthy way, and say, how can this help us to be better human beings? How can this help us to exercise our human rights? How can this help us to protect the human rights of others? So I'm still processing a lot of what you've said, but the big epiphany for me through the work that you've summarized today is how it can change our stance in advocating. Whether or not all of the technology companies will, stand shoulder to shoulder with us as we move forward, it is something that's unlikely, but we're certainly seeing that type of leadership from Snap, which was in the United States, had a reputation of being an extraordinarily unsafe platform for children and young people, and now under the leadership of Jacqueline Bouchier and others is becoming one of the industry standard setters. And you pointed out to them today that they are an example of a very efficient interventionist platform that responds very quickly to concerns that are raised to them. And so it's clear that some of these companies will step into that vision about how can we create a digital world that helps us to thrive, and that others will be left behind. But I love the shift in taking it with a different tone and tenor and vision than how many of us have been approaching this for the last 15 years. So thank you so much for that reframing.
Well, thank you. There's so much I would love to tell you, and I'm conscious that this is a scientific community I'm addressing. One of the things that we really worked hard at doing was developing a research and evidence-based, so that every piece of material, every program we develop is developed and co-designed with the communities in which we're delivering it to. But we also took a look at the work of David Finkelhor at the New Hampshire, I think it's the Crimes Against Children Center. He'd been doing great work, and Ernie had him at the Vatican event in 2017, where he was looking at the pedagogies and what resonates with people. And so we took some of his work, we had him out to Australia, and we worked with Carrie Ann Walsh from QUT. So we've now got an online safety best practice framework, because we know that if you go off and do one-off presentations, that's not going to be enough. If you used fear-based messages, that's going to lead to amygdala hijack, or if you're judging parents for being terrible parents. And we see sort of former police officers and psychologists going into schools. It's quite lucrative. You can make about $10,000 a pop to give these online safety presentations into class. But we've now got an accreditation system. We call it the Trusted E-Safety Providers, where we're making sure that they're using the right pedagogies. We're creating a community of practice. We're hearing about what they're seeing on the ground, but we're making sure that they're actually giving messages that are going to resonate and lead to meaningful behavioral change. That's what we need to do. There's also really some interesting work we did called Mind the Gap, where there is a huge digital disconnect in terms of what children are actually experiencing online and what their parents understand is happening. So 71% of young people said to us they're coming across seriously harmful content online. So disordered eating, suicidal or self-harm ideation, violent pornography. Because it's stigmatized and kids worry about device denial, they don't confide in their parents or a trusted adult. So only about 30% of parents thought that they might be coming across this kind of content. The other thing was interesting. We've worked for a long time around the minute they hand over that digital device in online lives, like they are their everyday lives, so that when things go wrong, kids know that they can come to them. But we found that, we started to have some impact where young people were starting to confide in adults or siblings or other trusted people, because we didn't want them to internalize this. It was leading to some serious issues that manifested, sadly, not a direct causal link, but a correlation between underlying mental health harms, cyberbullying, in-person bullying, leading to suicide. So we've been encouraging the help seeking. So kids are starting to do that. 70% said they remember having really important conversations with their parents about cyberbullying, and only half of their parents remembered having the conversations. We're also in a different mindset where we compartmentalize, oh, that's just happening online, honey, that's not the real world. Well, we need to understand that kids are wired totally differently. They don't make a distinction between their online and offline lives. And I think that COVID further reinforced that. So their online lives are an extension of their everyday lives, and they don't differentiate. So we need to understand that when we're engaging with them and trying to guide them through.
It's so interesting because some of what you're saying has come up in earlier sessions today. And so you've talked about not just education, but models of education and content that is delivered consistently and repetitively across time, which is something that some of the research that was presented earlier shows that you can't just talk about this in a one-off, and that you actually need to look at what are the educational design systems and the content that is effective. And we also have heard today about, using fear to try and get children to, stay safe online actually can worsen the situation, because it can cause them, when they do lose control of a situation, to think that it's the end of the world, that it's the end of their lives. And in fact, they may, cause or contribute to a decision to commit suicide. And so I appreciate both of those things that you say. The other thing that relates to research of frontline service providers, that we've done some research here looking at frontline service providers and what they're able to identify when their students or their clients disclose to them things that are happening to them online. And what we've seen in that research is that if the service provider doesn't have training and education that helps them to recognize what's going on, they're less likely to take it seriously or to talk to the child about it or to intervene as necessary to prevent the child from being abused or being further abused. So it's not just educating the children and the parents, but the social workers and the law enforcement and the teachers and the mental health professionals as well. So we're seeing that come back from the research as well. And it's so great to hear you talking about it.
Well, I mean, it is in the Australian context with an Australian evidence base, but all of our materials and programs are available for anyone to use. We've developed over time toolkits for schools, which include incident response for schools. We're developing e-safety champions. We hope to have in each school where we're continuing to kind of upskill them on these issues and how to respond when something goes wrong and where to go. We do a lot of training with law enforcement. We have a large percentage of people who come to us having experienced serious adult cyber abuse. It's often an extension of family and domestic violence. We call that technology facilitated abuse, or TFA. Cyber stalking, doxing, really on the serious end of online abuse. They may go to the police first, and depending who they get and how well educated the person at the particular station is, often get kind of responses like, well, why don't you just get off the internet, doll? Or why'd you send the intimate image in the first place? So back to this victim. So there's some cultural shift in some of our institutions that need to happen. We also have some learning management systems that are available to frontline workers. One of the first adult programs we did was in the tech and gendered space around this technology facilitated abuse space, because we know then that in almost 99.3% of all domestic and family violence cases, particularly when there's a separation or the woman generally gets a new job or has a baby, one of the ways of the non-custodial parent or the predator is to try and regain that control through technology facilitated abuse. And most of that is low tech. It could be like 500 harassing texts in a day, It could be turning on the GPS settings. It could to track where the partner is going. It could be, you know, surveillance devices are this small. We've seen them put in linings of handbags, in wallets, in teddy bears. We see non-custodial parents gifting iPads and iPhones with spyware on them, so that the children in almost 25% of cases are used to spy on their the custodial parent. But for a long time, people didn't know what this was, how to identify it, particularly frontline workers. So we've got a learning management system. If you're an allied health worker, a domestic violence worker, a counselor, or a police, you can access that training remotely. So we're happy to make all of this available. The more people who are using it and are educated, the better.
Definitely push that out. And as Ernie said, the Kempe Center we just celebrated our 51st anniversary. And the fact is that we're in a different century and we're in a different stage of time, and the nature of abuse is changing, and the ways in which abuse is being facilitated is changing. And it's critically important that we respond to a changing world, and that we're able to support children in this changing world. And you just touched on something else that we've heard from some of our other guests today, which is the importance of relationships and communication. That it's so important for kids to be able to talk to their parents and other family members and teachers and, you know, the people at church or whatever community groups that they're a part of, to talk to this. And this is consistent with the research that we're seeing come out of Johns Hopkins about how do you develop protective factors in children? How do you foster resilience across their childhood that can take them, you know, through that adult life, the rest of their life. And to hear you talk about the importance of making sure that parents are able to talk to their kids, and even if the parent doesn't realize how important that conversation was, that they don't even remember it happening, the fact that the kids feel comfortable talking to the adults in their lives is so critically important, to empower them to exercise their rights to participation, their rights to freedom of expression, their rights to assembly, you know, on these platforms, their rights to access educational material, and to develop these, you know, social groups that, you know, we on the one hand want our children to become independent during this stage of their life when most kids are starting to move into the digital world, and we want to foster that independence. And it's scary for us because so much is changing so quickly. And so remembering that love and that commitment and that communication is still the foundation that they need. And that's what we're seeing in research around digital safety, that, you know, having a solid home base, however you define home, is critical to their digital safety. And that isn't to put it all on the parents and all on the children, but, you know, we're certainly part of that, as you mentioned in what you've shared today. So thank you. Ernie, I noticed that Natalie asked a question in the chat. Do you want to ask that, or do you want me to?
No, I asked it.
Oh, I'm sorry. I missed that.
No, I asked Natalie's question already.
Okay, sorry.
Any other questions from anybody? Well, let me just say, Julie, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. My takeaway is that this is truly big tech's seatbelt moment, and I think there's a real opportunity with you as the global leader to begin to mobilize and bring safety by design and all these kinds of changes to what's an increasingly serious problem. Just read the other day that the third cause of death among 15 to 19-year-olds in the United States, according to the CDC, is now suicide. And I'm convinced that much of that is a byproduct of the digital age in which we live. So thank you so much for your leadership, for your vision, and for the impact that you are having in Australia and far beyond.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I look forward to continuing to work with you all.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Ernie. And thank you to all of you today for joining us for this track that we've had looking at 21st century child abuse, the impact of digital technologies. It's been a pleasure to be with all of you today. And we've all learned so much together, and I'm grateful to all of you. So thank you very much.